When Germany attacked in May 1940, the Allies expected a slow, grinding repeat of World War I. Instead, they faced something completely new, a lightning strike that broke their plans in days. France and Britain committed their best armies to Belgium, believing the German attack would mirror 1914. But this was exactly what Germany wanted. While Allied forces marched north, the real German blow was aimed farther south, through the Ardennes forest, a route Allied commanders considered impossible for tanks. For 3 days, German armored columns pushed through the narrow forest roads, undetected and underestimated. By the time French commanders realized what was happening, the Panzers were already emerging near Sedan. There, German forces launched a fast, coordinated assault. Tanks, dive bombers, and mobile infantry working together in a way the French weren't prepared for. The French units defending the Meuse were overwhelmed within hours. Panic spread, defensive lines collapsed, communications broke down. Once the Germans were across the river, the breakthrough became a flood. Panzers raced west toward the English Channel, cutting off the entire Allied army group in Belgium. The French and British were suddenly trapped, squeezed against the sea with nowhere to go. Blitzkrieg wasn't just speed, it was surprise, coordination, and psychological shock. The Allies never had a chance to recover, and the road to Dunkirk had begun. When Germany invaded on May 10, 1940, the Allies immediately executed the Dyle plan, marching their best French and British units into Belgium to stop the German advance early. It was a bold strategy, and on paper, it made sense. Fight the Germans far from French soil, link up with the Belgian army, and create a strong defensive line along the Dyle River. But the plan fell apart almost as soon as it began. Belgium's defenses, including the massive Fort Eben-Emael, were supposed to slow the Germans long enough for Allied forces to take their positions. Instead, they collapsed within hours. German glider troops landed on the fort's roof, blew through the defenses, and opened the way for armored divisions. The speed of the attack stunned Allied commanders. Meanwhile, the Belgian army was overwhelmed by rapid German thrusts and constant aerial bombardment. Bridges were destroyed, communication lines severed, and entire units were forced into chaotic retreats. The Allied advance to the Dyle became tangled with Belgian withdrawals, turning planned coordination into confusion. But the real disaster came from what the Allies couldn't see. The German feint through Belgium was only a distraction. While the British and French rushed north to hold the Dyle line, the main German armored force was already breaking through the Ardennes in the south. By the time the Allies realized the trap, the Germans had crossed the Meuse and were driving toward the English Channel, threatening to encircle the entire Allied northern group. The fall of Belgium didn't just break a defensive line, it shattered the strategic foundation of the entire Allied plan. The Dyle plan, built on outdated assumptions, collapsed under the weight of German speed, ingenuity, and deception, and the road to Dunkirk became inevitable.
In the second week of May 1940, the Allied armies in Belgium still believed they were fighting the main German assault. They were holding the Dyle line, exchanging fire, and trying to slow what looked like another German push through Flanders. But the real danger wasn't in front of them, it was behind them. While French and British forces were committed in the north, Germany's true armored spearheads had already broken through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse, and were racing west with astonishing speed. Their goal wasn't Paris. It was the English Channel. By May 20, German tanks reached the town of Aberville on the coast. With that single move, the Germans sliced the Allied front in two. The British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian Army, and France's best northern units were suddenly cut off, trapped in a vast pocket stretching from Lille to the Belgian coast. What had been an orderly defense turned overnight into a strategic catastrophe. The Allies were now surrounded on three sides: German armor pushing from the south, infantry divisions closing in from the east, and the North Sea sealing the west. The only narrow corridor still open was a shrinking strip to Dunkirk. Attempts to break out failed. Counterattacks ran into German tanks and Luftwaffe strikes. Communications were collapsing. Belgian forces were exhausted. The French First Army was being bled dry trying to hold the flanks. Every hour, the pocket tightened. By the time Allied commanders recognized the scale of the disaster, evacuation, not victory, had become the only option. Operation Dynamo was born from this encirclement, a desperate attempt to save what could still be saved. The fall of France began not with a single battle, but with a brilliant, ruthless maneuver that trapped the Allies before they even understood what had happened.
When the German breakthrough reached the Channel coast, it didn't just cut the Allied armies off, it trapped them inside one of the worst pieces of terrain imaginable for defense. This shrinking enclosure became known as the Dunkirk Pocket. At its heart was the small port of Dunkirk, a town never meant to evacuate hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The geography made the situation even worse. The surrounding land was a flat, open plain, low, exposed, and crisscrossed with canals. There were no hills to defend, no natural barriers to slow the enemy, and very few routes for retreat. To the north lay the sea, the only path to safety. To the west and south, German armored divisions tightened their grip. To the east, more German infantry advanced from Belgium. The pocket was being squeezed from all sides. The beaches themselves were a nightmare. They were wide and shallow, stretching for kilometers, with no deep-water harbor facilities. Large ships couldn't get close to shore. Soldiers had to wade out through surf, standing in long, vulnerable lines as German aircraft swept overhead. Behind the beaches, the town of Dunkirk was a burning maze of wreckage, bombed docks, destroyed warehouses, blocked roads. Fires lit the sky day and night. Every path to the port was choked with refugees, abandoned equipment, and retreating units trying to form makeshift defensive lines. Waterlogged marshes and flooded fields further narrowed escape corridors. Entire areas turned into muddy traps for vehicles. Roads were jammed or cut by bombing. The perimeter grew tighter by the hour. In this bleak geography, the Allied armies had only one hope: hold a thin semicircle long enough for ships, any ships, to come. The Dunkirk pocket wasn't just a military crisis. It was a geographic death trap that magnified every German advantage and every Allied vulnerability. The miracle of Dunkirk began in a place that seemed designed for defeat.
The Halt Order remains one of the most controversial decisions of World War II. In late May 1940, German armored divisions were racing toward Dunkirk. Nothing stood between them and the encircled Allied armies. The destruction of the British Expeditionary Force seemed only hours away. And then, suddenly, Hitler ordered the Panzers to stop. Why? To understand the Halt Order, we have to look at the situation on the ground. German armored units had been advancing at incredible speed for 2 weeks straight. Their supply lines were stretched, maintenance crews were exhausted, and many tanks were running on luck more than fuel. Some generals, including von Rundstedt, worried that the Panzers were dangerously overextended. If the Allies launched a counterattack, the Germans could lose their spearhead. Hitler listened to these concerns.
Rundstedt argued that the marshy terrain around Dunkirk was unsuitable for tanks, that the ground could bog them down, and that infantry should take over the final push. Hitler respected Rundstedt's judgment, so he paused the advance. But that's only part of the story. Politics played its role too. Hermann Göring insisted that his Luftwaffe could destroy the Allied armies trapped at Dunkirk. He wanted the glory for himself, not for the army. He convinced Hitler that his bombers would finish the job quickly and cleanly. No need to risk tanks. No need for further ground fighting. Let the Air Force crush the pocket. Hitler also believed the Allies were already beaten. He assumed the British would not commit to a long war and soon negotiate. If Britain wanted peace, pounding their army into the sand might not be the best opening gesture. Allowing some troops to escape seemed acceptable. The Panzers, Hitler thought, would be more valuable saved for the next phase of the war. So the order was given: halt the armor. Hold the line. Let the Luftwaffe work. As German tanks sat idle, British and French troops streamed toward the beaches. When the halt order was finally lifted, precious days had been lost. Infantry moved slowly. The Luftwaffe failed to stop the evacuation, and the Panzers, Germany's most decisive weapon, never reached Dunkirk in time. Was it a mistake? Most historians say yes. The halt order allowed more than 300,000 Allied soldiers to escape, preserving the core of the British Army. Without those men, Britain may not have been able to fight on. The war might have taken a very different path. In the end, the reason behind the halt order was not a single cause, but a mix: a fear of overextension, trust in conservative generals, Göring's ambition, and Hitler's misreading of British resolve. Together, they created one of the most significant pauses in military history, a pause that helped shape the outcome of World War II.
Hermann Göring made a promise that changed the course of the war. As the Allied armies retreated toward Dunkirk in May 1940, German panzer divisions were closing in fast. Victory seemed inevitable. Then, Göring stepped forward. He assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe alone could finish the job. His Air Force, he said, would crush the trapped British and French troops on the beaches. No need for tanks, no need for risky ground fighting. The Luftwaffe would deliver the final blow. Göring's confidence came from early success. For months, his aircraft had dominated the skies over Poland, the Low Countries, and France. Stuka dive bombers had shattered enemy morale. Fighter squadrons had swept aside resistance with shocking speed. Göring believed this pattern would continue. To him, Dunkirk was just another target waiting to be destroyed. But Göring failed to understand the unique challenges of the evacuation. The beaches at Dunkirk were wide and flat, offering almost no cover. Yet the troops were spread across miles of coastline. They were difficult to hit directly. The Luftwaffe had to fly long distances from bases in Germany and recently captured territories. Turnaround times were slow. Many aircraft were worn down from weeks of non-stop operations. Meanwhile, British fighter squadrons from the RAF, flying from nearby bases in England, arrived in force. They intercepted German bombers again and again. The RAF couldn't stop all the attacks, but they broke up formations, delayed bombing runs, and bought precious time. German pilots were shocked by the resistance. They expected a massacre, but instead found themselves in a fierce and costly air battle. Göring also underestimated the weather. Clouds, smoke, and sea haze frequently obscured targets. Bombs fell wide. Stukas struggled without clear visibility. The Luftwaffe's precision, the key to its earlier success, evaporated in the chaos. What Göring had imagined as a quick victory became a grinding, ineffective effort. Day after day, tens of thousands of Allied troops kept escaping across the Channel. Göring kept insisting his air crews would finish the job. Yet the numbers told another story.
Each night, more men left Dunkirk. Each day, German losses mounted. The Luftwaffe could not stop the evacuation, and the Panzers, which might have cut off the beaches completely, remained halted for too long. By the time Hitler realized Göring's promise had failed, it was too late. Over 300,000 Allied soldiers had escaped. They would form the backbone of Britain's continued resistance and its future army. In the end, Göring's overconfidence became one of the great strategic blunders of the war. His belief that air power alone could deliver victory at Dunkirk proved catastrophically wrong. It cost Germany the chance to destroy the British Expeditionary Force and change the course of World War II. The promise Göring made and could not keep helped ensure that Britain would fight on.
In May 1940, as France collapsed with terrifying speed, the British Expeditionary Force faced the decision that could determine the fate of an entire nation. At the center of that crisis stood one man, Lord John Gort, commander of the BEF. His decision, one that shocked the French, divided the British government, and changed the direction of the war, remains one of the most controversial moments in Allied command. At first, the British and French believed their joint offensive into Belgium would stop the German advance. Plans were confident, morale was high. But when German panzer divisions burst through the Ardennes and smashed across the Meuse, everything changed. The Allied armies in Belgium suddenly found themselves in danger of being completely cut off. Reports arriving at Gort's headquarters grew darker each hour. Communications were failing. French units meant to cover the flanks were collapsing. German armored columns were racing toward the Channel. The BEF's supply lines were severed. What had been a coordinated Allied front was disintegrating into chaos. Gort understood the situation more clearly than anyone. The French High Command, relying on outdated assumptions, insisted the BEF should counterattack south to reconnect with French forces. But Gort knew his army lacked the strength. Reserves were gone, fuel was low, ammunition was dwindling. Many units were already fighting desperate rearguard battles. A major offensive would likely end in total destruction. Under enormous pressure, Gort made the decision that would define his leadership. Against French orders and without approval from London, he began withdrawing the BEF north toward the coast. The goal was simple and brutal: survival. He believed the only hope for Britain was to save as many soldiers as possible for the defense of the homeland. Gort knew he was abandoning the French forces fighting beside him, but he also believed that staying would doom the entire Allied army. The withdrawal was chaotic and costly. Fighting was constant. Roads were jammed with refugees. German air attacks battered the columns. Yet Gort's decision bought time. It pulled the BEF back toward the beaches of Dunkirk, where a miracle evacuation would soon take shape. When the British cabinet learned what Gort had done, reactions were mixed. Some saw him as a realist who saved Britain's army from annihilation. Others believed he had betrayed the alliance with France, acting without coordination or political approval. French leaders were furious. They accused Britain of abandoning the fight and leaving France to collapse alone. But history offers a harsher truth. By May 20th, the BEF was already encircled. No counterattack could have reconnected them. Gort had recognized a reality that others refused to face. His decision gave Britain a fighting chance to survive the war. In the end, Gort's controversial choice helped enable the evacuation at Dunkirk and preserved the core of the British Army. It was a decision born in crisis, made under impossible conditions, and judged for decades afterward. But without it, Britain might have faced the future without an army and without hope.
By late May 1940, the German advance had torn the Allied front apart. The British Expeditionary Force and much of the French First Army were being driven north,
squeezed into an ever-shrinking pocket along the Channel coast. But at the city of Lille, a group of French units, outnumbered, exhausted, and nearly surrounded, made a decision that would change the fate of tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. The French rearguard at Lille was not a single unified force. It was a collection of battered divisions, many reduced by heavy fighting, others thrown together from retreating remnants. Their commanders understood the situation. They were trapped. German panzer divisions were closing in from every direction. The path to Dunkirk was already cut off. Escape was almost impossible. Yet, instead of attempting a desperate breakout, the French chose to stand and fight. From May 28th to May 31st, the Battle of Lille became one of the most heroic and least remembered actions of the entire campaign. The French forces held street after street, using every building, barricade, and bridge as a defensive position. The Germans brought tanks, artillery, and overwhelming numbers. The French responded with stubborn determination, launching counterattacks, delaying maneuvers, and refusing to surrender even when ammunition was running low. German reports expressed surprise at the ferocity of the defense. They expected a quick collapse. Instead, they ran into a wall of resistance that slowed their advance for days. Every hour the French held Lille was bought with blood, but every hour mattered. Far to the north at Dunkirk, British and French troops were rushing toward the beaches to escape encirclement. The evacuation was only just beginning, chaotic and fragile. A sudden German breakthrough could have smashed the escape routes and trapped the Allied armies completely. But the Germans could not turn their full attention to Dunkirk because French soldiers at Lille were still fighting, still holding them back. By the end of the battle, the defenders were surrounded on all sides. Cut off from supplies, overwhelmed, and with no hope of relief, they finally laid down their arms. Around 35,000 to 40,000 French troops went into captivity. But their stand had achieved what many thought impossible. They had bought precious time that allowed over 300,000 Allied soldiers to escape through Dunkirk. For decades, the heroism at Lille received little recognition, overshadowed by the larger story of the evacuation. But military historians now agree, without the sacrifice of these French rearguard units, the miracle of Dunkirk might never have happened. Their stand was one of the bravest, last-ditch defenses of the 1940 campaign, a moment when doomed soldiers chose duty over survival and changed history.
By late May 1940, the situation on the northern French coast was desperate. The German advance had cut off hundreds of thousands of Allied troops, leaving them trapped between the enemy and the sea. Roads were clogged with soldiers and refugees, artillery units were immobilized, and chaos reigned. Amid this crisis, the British government faced an impossible decision. Their army could not hold the line much longer. If something wasn't done, the best of Britain's forces would be lost forever. On May 26, 1940, Operation Dynamo was launched. The mission was clear but daunting. Evacuate as many troops as possible from the beaches of Dunkirk before the Germans could annihilate them. What made the task almost unimaginable was the scale and urgency of the operation. The ports were inadequate, the beaches shallow, and the tide of soldiers immense. The Royal Navy alone could not handle the numbers. Something unprecedented was required. It was then that Britain's civilians answered the call. Hundreds of small fishing boats, pleasure craft, ferries, and yachts sailed across the channel, joining the naval flotilla in what would become known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk. Pilots flew continuous missions over the beaches, offering air cover whenever they could. Soldiers formed impromptu lines, wading into the surf with whatever equipment they could carry, waiting for vessels to ferry them to safety. Every moment counted.
German aircraft and artillery were relentless, targeting troops and vessels alike. Fires burned along the coast, explosions rattled the sand, and the roar of engines filled the air. Yet despite the chaos, the operation began to work. Troops were lifted from the beaches, ferried across the Channel, and brought to England. Every rescue felt miraculous, every landing a small victory against overwhelming odds. Operation Dynamo was not a perfect plan. It was improvisation under fire. There were losses, mistakes, and moments of sheer terror. But it became a lifeline for the British Army, turning what seemed like total disaster into a story of endurance and ingenuity. From May 26th onward, the miracle of Dunkirk unfolded, day by day, as thousands of soldiers were plucked from the jaws of defeat. In those frantic days, desperation gave way to hope. Improvisation became strategy, and the courage of ordinary sailors and soldiers ensured that Britain's army would live to fight another day. Operation Dynamo had begun, and with it, the legend of Dunkirk was born.
Amid the chaos of Dunkirk, it quickly became clear that the Royal Navy alone could not evacuate the hundreds of thousands of trapped soldiers. The beaches were crowded, shallow, and exposed to constant German air attacks. Larger ships could only come so close. If the army was to survive, Britain would need help from an unexpected source: its civilians. Across southern England, a call went out. Small boats, fishing vessels, pleasure crafts, ferries, and even personal yachts were pressed into service. Men who had never seen combat prepared to cross the Channel and sail into one of the most dangerous stretches of water in modern history. They had no idea what awaited them: bombs, strafing aircraft, mines, and storm-tossed seas, but they answered the call anyway. These vessels became known as the Little Ships of Dunkirk. They were slow, vulnerable, and tiny compared to the German war machine, yet their size allowed them to reach soldiers trapped on beaches and shallow waters that larger ships could not access. Many of the sailors were untrained in naval warfare. Many were volunteers whose experience came from fishing or yachting. But in those desperate hours, courage and determination mattered more than experience. The little ships ferried troops from the beaches to larger ships waiting offshore, or, in some cases, carried them all the way across the Channel to England. Some made multiple trips, some were hit by bombs or machine gun fire. Yet thousands of soldiers owed their survival to these civilian sailors, whose courage allowed them to escape what had seemed like certain death. The civilian armada was more than a logistical solution. It became a symbol of national resolve. Soldiers witnessing these tiny vessels braving the Channel amid explosions and smoke later described it as miraculous. It was ordinary people doing extraordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. Their willingness to risk life and vessel made the impossible possible. By the end of Operation Dynamo, over 300,000 Allied soldiers had been rescued. A significant portion of that number owed their lives directly to the little ships. Without them, the beaches of Dunkirk might have become a graveyard for Britain's best-trained troops. Their courage, selflessness, and improvisation turned a desperate evacuation into a story of heroism and hope, a story that would echo through history as the heart of the Dunkirk legend.
By late May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force and thousands of French soldiers were trapped along the beaches of Dunkirk. The Royal Navy faced an unprecedented challenge: evacuate hundreds of thousands of troops under constant threat from the Luftwaffe and advancing German forces. The scale of the operation pushed the Navy to the breaking point. The Royal Navy mobilized every available ship, destroyers, minesweepers, troop transports, and requisitioned civilian vessels. Crews worked around the clock, often without sleep, navigating narrow channels clogged with soldiers, debris, and wreckage. Each journey across the channel was perilous. Bombs fell from the sky, artillery shells struck the shore, and German aircraft prowled overhead, seeking to sink as many ships as possible. Despite the chaos, the Navy coordinated a continuous flow of vessels to the beaches. Soldiers were loaded quickly, often wading through waist-deep water to reach waiting boats. Destroyers and warships provided covering fire, while smaller craft ferried men to safer, deeper waters. Every hour brought more danger. Ships could be destroyed at any moment. Crews could be lost, and the beaches could be overrun before reinforcements arrived. Fuel, supplies, and manpower were stretched thin. Repairs had to be made mid-operation, often under fire. Captains made impossible decisions: which troops to rescue first, which ships could risk the crossing, and when to retreat. Morale was tested, but the determination of the sailors held. They knew the survival of Britain's army depended on their courage and skill. In the end, the Royal Navy's efforts were nothing short of heroic. They orchestrated one of the largest amphibious evacuations in history, moving hundreds of thousands of men to safety under extreme pressure. But it came at a cost. Ships were damaged or sunk, sailors were killed or wounded, and the physical and mental strain on crews was immense. The Navy had reached its limit, yet they persevered. Without the Royal Navy's endurance, Dunkirk could have ended in catastrophe. Their resilience, organization, and sheer determination turned a potential annihilation into a miraculous evacuation, proving that even at the breaking point, courage and discipline could change the course of a nation's fate.
As soldiers fled toward Dunkirk, a quieter but equally vital battle raged in the skies above. The Royal Air Force, often overshadowed by the drama on the beaches, played a critical role in buying time and protecting the evacuation. Without their efforts, the miracle of Dunkirk might never have succeeded. The RAF faced enormous challenges. Luftwaffe aircraft patrolled the channel relentlessly, bombing troops and ships alike. German Stukas and bombers targeted the beaches, aiming to disrupt the evacuation and crush morale. The RAF had to intercept these attacks, often flying long distances from bases in southern England, with limited fuel and relentless pressure. Fighter pilots engaged in continuous sorties, dogfighting with enemy aircraft, strafing the skies to scatter bombers, and shielding the beaches whenever possible. They flew multiple missions each day, frequently returning with damaged planes or exhausted crews, only to take off again. Their presence kept the Luftwaffe from focusing entirely on the evacuation, giving soldiers precious minutes and hours to board ships. The RAF also coordinated with the Royal Navy and the little ships, providing reconnaissance and spotting German movements. Even when outnumbered, they forced German pilots to fly higher, bomb less accurately, and break formations. Every attack they repelled reduced casualties and slowed the German advance. Despite facing overwhelming odds, extreme fatigue, and constant danger, RAF crews remained relentless. Many airmen never received recognition comparable to the soldiers on the beaches, yet their contribution was crucial. Their ability to maintain pressure on the Luftwaffe, protect evacuation routes, and boost morale allowed Operation Dynamo to succeed. In the end, the RAF's unseen heroism ensured that the evacuation continued day after day. While soldiers waded through the surf and civilian sailors braved the channel, fighter pilots battled in the skies above. Their courage and sacrifice saved thousands of lives and preserved the core of Britain's army. Dunkirk was not only a miracle on the beaches, it was a triumph in the air as well.
The beaches of Dunkirk were a scene of unimaginable chaos. Soldiers, civilians, and sailors crowded into narrow strips of sand, surrounded by water on one side and advancing German forces on the other. Explosions shattered the air, smoke and fire filled the sky, and the roar of engines, artillery, and aircraft created a constant, deafening din. German bombs fell relentlessly. Stuka dive bombers attacked columns of troops waiting to board ships, while artillery shells struck the sand and nearby towns. Fires ignited warehouses, fuel depots, and vehicles, sending plumes of smoke over the evacuation area. Men waded through burning wreckage, carrying their comrades, equipment, and supplies, all while avoiding falling bombs and strafing aircraft. The chaos was magnified by the sheer number of soldiers. Thousands crowded the beaches, waiting for limited transport. Troop columns became clogged with mud, debris, and abandoned equipment. Communication broke down. Officers shouted orders that could barely be heard over the explosions and screaming. Panic was never far from every group, yet discipline and courage kept the lines moving. Ships attempting to approach the shore faced shallow waters and obstacles. Many vessels were damaged by enemy fire before reaching safety, forcing soldiers to wade through deep, cold water while carrying what they could. Some boats were lost entirely, sinking with troops inside. Every crossing was a risk, every landing a battle. Amid this horror, acts of heroism and sacrifice were constant. Soldiers helped wounded comrades, sailors guided boats through treacherous waters, and civilians braved the channel in tiny vessels to save strangers. Each life rescued was a small triumph against the overwhelming destruction surrounding them.
At the heart of the Dunkirk evacuation stood a remarkable structure, the mole. This long, sturdy pier stretched into the channel and became one of Britain's most critical lifelines during Operation Dynamo. While the beaches were crowded, shallow, and constantly under attack, the mole offered a stable platform for ships to dock, load troops, and return to England. The pier was not designed for a military evacuation. Originally built for cargo and passenger ferries, it had narrow walkways and limited docking capacity. Yet, in the chaos of Dunkirk, it became indispensable. Large transport ships could not approach the shallow beaches safely, but the mole allowed them to take on thousands of soldiers at once, dramatically increasing the speed and efficiency of the evacuation. Every day, British troops streamed down the pier, moving quickly under fire and smoke. Destroyers and cargo vessels berthed alongside, taking on soldiers and pulling away from the enemy's reach. The mole became a magnet for attacks. German aircraft targeted it relentlessly, trying to destroy the pier and trap troops on the beaches. Fires, shrapnel, and collapsing sections of wood added to the danger, but the pier remained functional, a testament to its solid construction and the courage of those working on it. Small vessels ferried soldiers from the beach to the mole, ensuring a continuous flow. Officers coordinated movements under constant stress, directing troops and vessels alike. Every ship that left the pier carried hundreds, sometimes thousands of men to safety, turning this modest structure into a strategic lifeline. In the story of Dunkirk, the mole stands out as more than wood and nails. It was the bridge between imminent disaster and survival. Without it, the evacuation would have been slower, far more chaotic, and far more deadly. The pier's significance went beyond its physical presence. It became a symbol of hope, order, and resilience amid one of the greatest military crises of the Second World War. While the evacuation at Dunkirk is remembered as a miracle, not all stories from Operation Dynamo ended in survival. One of the darkest moments came on June 17, 1940, with the sinking of the SS Lancastria, a British troop ship evacuating soldiers and civilians from the beaches of Saint-Nazaire. The Lancastria was heavily loaded that day, far beyond its official capacity. Thousands of soldiers, RAF personnel, and civilians were crammed onto the decks, desperate to escape the advancing German forces. The ship was part of a convoy tasked with moving men to safety, but it was vulnerable. The Luftwaffe had gained air superiority, and attacks on shipping along the French coast were relentless. German bombers struck the Lancastria with devastating precision. Bombs hit the vessel directly, igniting fires and causing explosions that tore through the crowded decks. Panic spread instantly. Soldiers and civilians scrambled for lifeboats, many of which were inadequate or inaccessible due to the ship's overloading. Others jumped into the cold Atlantic waters, only to be swept away by waves or trapped by debris. The sinking of the Lancastria stands as a sobering reminder that Dunkirk was not a flawless miracle. Alongside the story of rescue and endurance, there was tragedy, loss, and the human cost of war. It is remembered today as one of the darkest chapters of Operation Dynamo, a stark counterpoint to the triumph on the beaches. While the evacuation at Dunkirk is often remembered as a British miracle, the story of the French troops who fought alongside the British is less well known. These men played a critical role in holding back the German advance, buying precious time for thousands of soldiers to reach the beaches and escape across the Channel. Their sacrifice was immense, yet history has often overlooked it. French forces were tasked with defending key positions around Dunkirk, forming rearguard lines against a powerful and fast-moving enemy. They faced relentless attacks from German infantry, tanks, and aircraft. Outnumbered and stretched thin, they fought with determination, holding bridges, roads, and villages long enough to prevent the Germans from overrunning the evacuation zones. Their actions were costly. Thousands of French soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Entire units were destroyed in fierce fighting, and many of those who survived spent the remainder of the war as prisoners. Meanwhile, their efforts enabled the British Expeditionary Force and other Allied units to escape the encirclement. Without the French holding the line, Dunkirk could have ended in complete disaster. Despite their heroism, the French rearguard has often been overshadowed in accounts of Dunkirk. The focus has remained on the Royal Navy, the little ships, and the RAF, while the French contribution is rarely emphasized. Yet history historians agree that their sacrifice was decisive. Each hour they held the Germans at bay added life-saving minutes to the evacuation timetable. The French troops at Dunkirk embodied courage and discipline in the face of overwhelming odds. They fought not for glory, but to give others a chance to survive. Their actions remind us that the miracle of Dunkirk was not achieved by one nation alone. It was a collective effort, and the bravery of the French soldiers deserves to be remembered alongside the more celebrated stories of ships and planes. In the end, Dunkirk was a story of survival, heroism, and sacrifice. And among the untold stories, the French rearguard stands as a testament to courage under fire, a forgotten pillar upon which the evacuation and the future of the Allied war effort was built.
The evacuation at Dunkirk was a stunning failure for Germany. In May 1940, German forces had achieved one of the fastest and most decisive advances in military history, cutting off hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. Yet despite their overwhelming advantage, they failed to prevent the evacuation across the Channel. The reasons lie in a combination of strategy, overconfidence, and miscalculations. One major factor was the Halt order issued by Hitler. On May 24th, he instructed the armored divisions to stop their advance short of Dunkirk. Tanks that could have crushed the trapped British and French forces were held back, allowing the Allies precious time to organize their evacuation. The order was influenced by fear of overextension, marshy terrain, and the belief that the Luftwaffe alone could finish the job. The Luftwaffe itself became another reason for failure. Hermann Göring had promised that his aircraft could destroy the Allied armies on the beaches, but the Air Force was overconfident and overstretched. Bad weather, effective RAF defense, and the sheer chaos of the beaches prevented them from delivering decisive blows. Bombing runs were often inaccurate, and thousands of troops were evacuated under the noses of German aircraft. Coordination issues also played a role. German forces were advancing faster than their supply lines could support, and infantry lagged behind the Panzers. Communication between units was inconsistent, leaving gaps in the encirclement. These delays allowed the Allies to consolidate their positions on the beaches and organize transport. Lastly, the Allies themselves were resourceful and resilient. The Royal Navy, reinforced by civilian vessels known as the Little Ships, maintained a continuous flow of evacuations. RAF pilots fought tirelessly to defend the beaches, and French and British troops held defensive lines under constant attack. The combination of courage, improvisation, and discipline outpaced German expectations. In the end, Germany's failure at Dunkirk was not a single mistake, but a series of compounded errors. Overconfidence in air power, cautious leadership decisions, logistical challenges, and the determined resistance of the Allies allowed more than 300,000 soldiers to escape. What could have been a catastrophic defeat for Britain instead became a lifeline and a story of remarkable survival.
In May 1940, as German forces swept through France, one commander's reputation soared: Erwin Rommel, leading the 7th Panzer Division. His advance through the Ardennes and into northern France was rapid, audacious, and seemingly unstoppable. But was it the product of genius or simply extraordinary luck? Rommel's maneuver was bold. He exploited weaknesses in the Allied lines, moving through dense forests and rough terrain that the French believed impassable for armored units. His tanks and mechanized infantry struck with speed and coordination, bypassing fortified positions and encircling slower, less mobile forces. In this sense, the advance demonstrated tactical brilliance, showcasing his ability to adapt, anticipate, and seize the initiative. Yet timing played a critical role. The Allies were already overextended, with units dispersed and communications strained. French and Belgian forces had misread German intentions, leaving gaps that Rommel's forces exploited. Reinforcements and reserves were slow to respond, creating opportunities that, while skillfully used, were made possible by Allied mistakes. In other words, the environment was primed for success, and Rommel capitalized on it. Rommel's leadership style also mattered. He inspired his troops with energy and decisiveness, often leading from the front and making rapid, independent decisions. This contrasted sharply with more cautious German commanders, allowing the 7th Panzer Division to maintain momentum where other units faltered. His ability to innovate on the fly, choosing alternate routes, attacking unexpectedly, and pushing beyond logistical limits amplified the impact of his advance. The combination of skill, daring, and fortunate circumstances produced one of the fastest armored advances of the war. While some historians debate whether luck or genius predominated, the result was undeniable. Allied lines collapsed, the path to the Channel opened, and Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox of Europe began to take shape. Ultimately,
Rommel's advance was neither purely luck nor purely brilliance. It was a dynamic mix, audacious planning executed with skill, amplified by timing and the mistakes of others. It reshaped the French campaign, setting the stage for Dunkirk and demonstrating how speed, initiative, and opportunity could combine to devastating effect.
May 26, 1940. Operation Dynamo begins. The order is given: evacuate the trapped Allied armies from Dunkirk. The beaches are chaotic, under constant bombardment, but the first destroyers and transport ships begin loading troops. Only a few thousand are rescued, far below what is needed. May 27th. German pressure increases. The Luftwaffe attacks relentlessly. Fires spread across the port. Thousands of exhausted soldiers wait in lines stretching down the beaches. Despite the chaos, nearly 8,000 men are lifted off. The Royal Navy realizes the task will be far harder than expected. May 28th. Belgium surrenders. The collapse of the Belgian army leaves the Dunkirk perimeter dangerously exposed. German forces push closer, tightening the ring. But evacuation numbers jump as more ships arrive. Little ships, fishing boats, yachts, tugboats begin joining the effort. May 29th. The worst day for the Royal Navy. German bombers devastate the harbor. Multiple destroyers are sunk. Hundreds drown when ships capsize offshore. Yet the evacuation continues. Over 47,000 troops are rescued, proof that even under fire, the operation will not stop. May 30th. The perimeter holds. French units fight house by house to keep German troops back. Their sacrifice buys crucial hours. Evacuation totals climb again. Winston Churchill demands the impossible: bring out every man you can. May 31st. The miracle grows. The little ships now swarm the coast, shuttling soldiers from the shallow beaches to larger vessels offshore. Evacuation numbers explode. 68,000 men in a single day. Morale rises. The miracle is becoming real. June 1st. Tragedy and triumph. The Luftwaffe strikes brutally. The beaches become killing grounds. Casualties spike. But the Royal Navy holds its nerve, and the flow of men continues. Over 60,000 escape, even beneath fire. June 2nd. The British evacuation ends. Most remaining British forces are now out. Attention shifts to the French. Though German troops press harder, thousands of French soldiers still reach the ships. British commanders stay longer than planned to save their allies. June 3rd. The final stand of the French. Only scattered French units remain inside the shrinking perimeter. Ammunition is low. The last large evacuation effort pulls out thousands more. The beaches are almost empty. June 4th. The last boat leaves Dunkirk. A final group of French troops is rescued before dawn. Hours later, German forces march on to the beaches. Operation Dynamo is over. 338,000 soldiers, British, French, Belgian, have escaped. A miracle created not by luck, but by courage, sacrifice, and the refusal to surrender.
At the start of the Dunkirk crisis, morale among Allied troops was collapsing. The sudden German breakthrough, the speed of the encirclement, and the constant air attacks created an atmosphere of fear, confusion, and disbelief. Soldiers who had trained for years suddenly found themselves retreating, not fighting. Many felt abandoned by strategy, by leadership, and even by fate. On the roads of France, panic spread. Refugee columns mixed with retreating units, clogging every route to the coast. Aircraft strafed the highways. Rumors raced faster than orders. The Germans are already behind us. We're surrounded. No ships are coming. To many, it felt like the end. But everything changed the moment the men reached Dunkirk. Instead of total collapse, they discovered something unexpected: organization, determination, and a stubborn will to survive. Lines formed on the beaches. Officers restored discipline. Small groups of soldiers began taking up defensive positions, determined to keep the perimeter intact. French units held the line with quiet heroism, often fighting to the last round. And then the ships appeared. The sight of the Royal Navy destroyers, followed by trawlers, ferries, fishing boats, pleasure craft, transformed the mood. Panic turned to hope, hope turned to unity, and unity hardened into defiance. Troops who had expected to die now helped manage queues, carried wounded comrades, directed stragglers, and even cheered when a new vessel arrived. Instead of chaos, there was cooperation. Instead of despair, resolve. Even under bombing, even as the beaches turned into fire and smoke, the men clung to one idea: if we hold together, we will get out. By the time Operation Dynamo ended, morale had undergone a complete reversal. Dunkirk did not just save an army, it restored its spirit. The retreat became a symbol of resilience, and the men who escaped carried that spirit into the dark years that followed. The morale story of Dunkirk is not of panic. It is a story of panic overcome, a story of fear giving way to defiance, a moment where ordinary soldiers chose not to collapse, but to stand, endure, and survive.
When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, he inherited a nightmare. France was collapsing. The German breakthrough had split the Allied front in two, and the British Expeditionary Force, over 300,000 soldiers, was trapped against the sea. Churchill faced a decision no leader ever wants to make. Should Britain risk everything to keep fighting for France, or pull back and save its own army? At first, Churchill refused to consider evacuation. Britain had promised to defend France to the end. Losing the BEF would gut the British army, but abandoning France could mean losing the war morally, politically, and diplomatically. French leaders pleaded for reinforcements. They believed more British troops might stabilize the front. Churchill feared the opposite. Sending more men might only add to the coming disaster. Every option was bad. Every hour brought worse news. Meanwhile, the BEF commander, Lord Gort, was secretly preparing to retreat. He saw the truth on the ground. The front was collapsing too quickly, and holding France was becoming impossible. Churchill, in London, struggled to accept that reality. He wanted a counterattack, a resurgence, anything that might show France had not yet fallen. But the German advance left no room for illusions. By May 25, Churchill realized the grim truth. If Britain sacrificed the BEF trying to hold a doomed front, the nation would be left defenseless. There would be no army to stop an invasion, no force to continue the war. Britain itself would likely fall. So Churchill made the hardest choice of his life. He approved Operation Dynamo, the evacuation from Dunkirk. It was a decision he described as tasting like a bitter cup, because it meant accepting that France could not be saved. Yet it was also a decision that ensured Britain could fight on. Churchill hoped to save 30,000 men. He saved over 338,000. And because the army survived, Britain survived. Churchill's dilemma, save the army or hold France, was never truly a choice between courage and retreat. It was a choice between losing a battle and losing the war. By choosing to save the army, he gave Britain the strength it needed to stand alone and someday fight back.
Dunkirk is remembered as a miracle, a heroic escape, and a turning point. But much of what people think they know is myth. Here's what actually happened. Myth number 1. The British Army stood proudly on the beaches and waited for rescue. Reality. Most soldiers were not standing on the sand. They were packed into makeshift defensive lines, fighting constant German attacks to keep the pocket from collapsing. Many spent hours or days hiding in dunes, cellars, or drainage ditches under bombardment. Myth number 2. The little ships saved everyone. Reality: the civilian boats were heroic, but they were a small part of a massive military operation. The Royal Navy and naval crews evacuated the majority of troops, almost 90%, using destroyers, transports, and warships. Myth number 3. The RAF abandoned Dunkirk. Reality: RAF fighters were fighting desperately away from the beaches, over inland approach routes where German bombers formed up. Because their battles happened out of sight, soldiers on the sand often assumed the RAF wasn't there. In reality, the RAF lost hundreds of aircraft trying to protect the evacuation. Myth number 4. Hitler let the British escape on purpose. Reality: the Halt order was influenced by confusion, poor intelligence, bad terrain for tanks, and Göring's overconfidence in the Luftwaffe, not a diplomatic gesture. Hitler did not expect Britain to escape with its army intact, and the German High Command was shocked by the evacuation's success. Myth number 5. Dunkirk was a great victory. Reality: Dunkirk was a brilliant rescue, but also a massive defeat. Britain saved its army, but lost nearly all of its heavy equipment. France was collapsing, and the Germans were barely slowed. Myth number 6. The evacuation was orderly and controlled. Reality: parts of it were, but much of the experience was chaos. Bombings, burning ships, crowded piers, panic on the beaches, and terrified soldiers who weren't sure if rescue would ever come. Myth number 7. Dunkirk meant Britain was safe. Reality: Britain still faced the possibility of invasion. Dunkirk saved the army, but didn't guarantee survival. What it did guarantee was that Britain could continue the war with real soldiers to fight another day. Dunkirk wasn't a miracle in the supernatural sense. It was a desperate, improvised operation built on bravery, sacrifice, and luck, far from the clean legend it later became.
For decades, Dunkirk has been called a miracle. But what does that actually mean? Was it divine luck, brilliant strategy, or just a desperate escape that happened to succeed? The truth is somewhere in between. First, it was a miracle of survival. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped by one of the fastest, most devastating offensives in modern history. The German army had split the front, surrounded the Allies, and pushed them to the sea. On paper, the BEF shouldn't have escaped. By every military calculation, they should have been destroyed. But they weren't. Second, it was a miracle of timing. The German Halt order, still debated today, froze the Panzers at the critical moment. Whether caused by caution, confusion, or Göring's overconfidence, those 48 hours gave Britain the window it needed to evacuate hundreds of thousands of men. If the tanks hadn't stopped, the story would have ended on the beaches. Third, it was a miracle of coordination under fire. The Royal Navy, civilian volunteers, engineers, and rearguard troops all performed beyond expectations. Destroyers ferried soldiers non-stop. Civilians took their own boats across mined waters. Rearguard units fought to the last bullet to keep escape corridors open. None of it was perfect, but it worked. Fourth, it was a miracle of morale. The British people needed hope. Dunkirk gave it to them. Churchill refused to call it a victory, but he knew it proved one thing. Britain wasn't going to collapse like France. It would fight on. But here's the other side of the story. Dunkirk wasn't miraculous in the sense of triumph. It was a rescue from catastrophe, not a win on the battlefield. Tens of thousands were left behind. Almost all British heavy equipment was lost. France was doomed. The Germans were barely slowed. So was Dunkirk a miracle? Yes, but not because of magic. because despite every military, strategic, and logistical disadvantage, Britain saved the only army it had, and that army would go on to fight in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and beyond. The miracle wasn't the escape itself. The miracle was that Britain lived to fight another day.
When the last British ships pulled away from Dunkirk, the story was not over. For France, it was only the beginning of the end. The evacuation saved the British Army, but it also left France critically weakened. Nearly a third of the Allied forces were gone, and with them went tanks, artillery, trucks, and the belief that the front could be restored. French commanders tried to regroup. They pulled together new defensive lines along the Somme and the Aisne, but the German army was already preparing its second blow, Fall Rot, the final offensive to crush France. The Germans attacked on June 5, 1940. This time there was no breakthrough to stop. The French army was exhausted, undersupplied, and overwhelmed. Units fought bravely, but Germany's mobility, air power, and momentum were unstoppable. Within days, cities collapsed one after another. Refugees filled every road, slowing military movements and causing chaos. Paris declared an open city to avoid destruction. The government fled south, desperately trying to decide whether to fight on or seek terms. Inside the French leadership, a political war erupted. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud wanted to continue the fight from North Africa, but Marshal Philippe Pétain, the national hero of World War I, argued that enough blood had been spilled. To him, further resistance meant pointless ruin. As the German advance accelerated, Pétain's view prevailed. On June 17th, Pétain addressed the nation. The fighting must cease. It was a moment that shocked the world. France, the great power of Europe, with the largest army on the continent, was giving up after just 6 weeks of fighting. The Germans insisted on humiliating terms. They required the armistice to be signed in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler personally attended, savoring the reversal of history. The armistice signed on June 22nd carved France in two. The north and the Atlantic coast were occupied by Germany. The south, governed from Vichy under Pétain, became a free zone in name only, but in reality a puppet state. The French army was reduced, its navy neutralized, and millions of French soldiers were marched into captivity. France had fallen. The most powerful army in Europe had been defeated faster than anyone thought possible. For Britain, the fall of France meant standing alone. For Germany, it meant domination of Western Europe. For France, it meant occupation, division, and years of hardship. The aftermath of Dunkirk wasn't just a British escape. It was the beginning of France's darkest chapter of the 20th century.
While hundreds of thousands of soldiers waited on the beaches of Dunkirk, another group fought a very different battle, one that most never returned from. These were the Rearguard, the men ordered to stay behind so that others could escape. Their job was simple and brutal: hold the German army for as long as humanly possible. They fought in towns, canals, farms, and crossroads, buying hours and sometimes minutes. But every minute they held was another minute for soldiers to reach the beach, another ship to load, another life saved. Most of the Rearguard knew exactly what their orders meant. They weren't coming home. Units like the British 2nd Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment, the 1st Cheshires, and the French 12th Motorized Division fought delaying actions against vastly superior German forces. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and often cut off. Many battled until their ammunition ran out, then fought on with bayonets,
grenades, or whatever they could find. At Lille, 4 French divisions held off 7 German divisions for 4 days, an act of sacrifice that saved tens of thousands at Dunkirk. These men fought street to street, house to house, fully aware they were surrounded. When they finally surrendered, they had no regrets. They had done what was asked of them. Other rearguard groups were overrun without hope of escape. Some were killed in desperate firefights. Others were captured with no idea what would happen next. A few tried to slip through German lines at night, but were caught or forced into hiding. For the British, many rearguard soldiers entered captivity and spent the rest of the war in POW camps far from home. Conditions varied. Some survived with relative stability. Others endured harsh labor, hunger, and disease. For French soldiers, capture often meant years of imprisonment in Germany, forced labor, or separation from their families until the war's end. But despite the tragedy, their sacrifice achieved its purpose. Every hour they held off the Panzers helped fill another boat. Every road they blocked slowed the advance toward the beaches. Without the rear guard, Dunkirk would not have been a miracle. It would have been a massacre. The men left behind were not forgotten by those they saved. Even as they boarded ships under fire, soldiers whispered the same words again and again. "Someone is holding the line for us." The fate of the rearguard is one of the most painful stories of Dunkirk, a story not of escape, but of courage, duty, and sacrifice made in the full knowledge that others would live because they stayed behind.
Dunkirk turned defeat into defiance. Before the evacuation, morale was collapsing. France was falling, the army was trapped, and invasion felt inevitable. The successful rescue of hundreds of thousands of soldiers flipped the national atmosphere from despair to determination. A sense took hold that Britain had survived a blow that should have destroyed it. The idea of the Dunkirk spirit was born. Perseverance, calmness under fire, and ordinary people stepping forward in extraordinary circumstances became central to the story. The civilian little ships reinforced the belief that Britain's strength came from its entire population, not just its military leaders. Churchill's framing gave Dunkirk its meaning. Through his speeches, he transformed a retreat into a moral victory. Instead of focusing on what was lost, he emphasized what had been saved and what it represented. His words forged a narrative of resolve. Britain would continue fighting no matter the odds. A new sense of unity spread through society. The evacuation blurred social and class boundaries. Aristocrats and workers sailed their own vessels to rescue soldiers. Officers and privates stood in the same water waiting for evacuation. This sense of shared struggle fed into a broader idea of a people's war that shaped Britain's wartime and post-war identity. Hardship became mythology. British culture has long admired quiet courage and endurance. Dunkirk amplified these traits and elevated them into a national identity. The experience became a touchstone for what it means to stay steady, improvise under pressure, and persist when logic says defeat is inevitable.
When Britain faced its darkest hour in 1940, the fall of France and the evacuation at Dunkirk left the nation shaken. Fear and uncertainty spread. Many wondered if Britain could survive the war. It was in this moment that Winston Churchill delivered his speech to the House of Commons. His words were not just rhetoric, they were a call to courage. He acknowledged the setbacks, the losses, and the danger, but he framed them not as reasons to despair, but as challenges to meet with resolve. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared. Every phrase echoed determination. Beaches, landing grounds, fields, streets, no matter the terrain, no matter the threat, Britain would stand. The speech transformed the mood of the nation.
Panic and fear gave way to defiance and unity. Churchill did more than inspire soldiers. He inspired civilians, workers, and ordinary citizens. His words helped forge the idea that Britain would resist, endure, and never surrender. From the ashes of defeat, a sense of national purpose and courage emerged. The speech became a symbol of Britain's identity during the war: resilience, steadfastness, and the unyielding belief that even when facing improbable odds, the country would continue to fight. Churchill's message was clear: Britain would survive, and its spirit could not be broken. The nation's defiance became its greatest weapon.
For the Germans, Dunkirk was a story of frustration and missed opportunity. By late May 1940, the Wehrmacht had executed one of the fastest campaigns in military history. The Allied armies were trapped, the Channel ports were within reach, and victory seemed imminent. Yet, despite overwhelming superiority, the British Expeditionary Force escaped. German commanders were shocked and angered. Many blamed Hitler's Halt order, which stopped the armored divisions just short of Dunkirk. Tanks that could have crushed the Allies were held back, leaving only the Luftwaffe to finish the job. The Air Force, overconfident under Hermann Göring, failed to deliver decisive results. Poor coordination, fatigue, and challenging weather limited their effectiveness. Bombing runs scattered troops but could not prevent thousands from reaching the beaches. Pilots and ground commanders alike felt the operation had slipped through their fingers. Internal German debates were heated. Some officers argued that Hitler had missed a historic opportunity to destroy the British Army. Others admitted that logistical challenges and overextension made a total destruction impossible. Confusion, rivalry, and misjudgment combined to let the Allies escape. Dunkirk left a bitter mark on German morale. While the campaign continued successfully in France, commanders could not shake the sense that a decisive victory had been within reach and had been lost. The escape of the British Expeditionary Force remained a glaring what-if in German military history, a reminder that even overwhelming power can falter when timing, judgment, and coordination fail. Dunkirk was more than a temporary escape for the British. It shaped how Hitler and the German High Command thought about the war. The failure to annihilate the British Expeditionary Force left a permanent mark on German strategy and confidence. Hitler realized that even overwhelming power could be thwarted by hesitation, poor coordination, or unexpected resolve. The British escape proved that an army could survive against superior forces if it was determined, disciplined, and helped by favorable circumstances. In the months following Dunkirk, Hitler became increasingly cautious about direct confrontations with Britain. He postponed plans for a full-scale invasion of the British Isles, underestimating the difficulty of defeating a nation that, while battered, had preserved its core fighting force. At the same time, the success of the Luftwaffe at Dunkirk, though incomplete, reinforced Hitler's belief in the effectiveness of air power. He assumed air superiority could achieve decisive results in future campaigns, a miscalculation that would later influence the Battle of Britain and Operation Barbarossa. Dunkirk also influenced Hitler's perception of Britain's resilience. While he initially thought the British might seek peace after France fell, the evacuation proved they were willing to fight on. This realization hardened his strategy in the West, but it also created a persistent undercurrent of frustration and obsession with defeating Britain, a factor that would shape the next 2 years of the war. Ultimately, Dunkirk taught Hitler a hard lesson. Victories on paper do not guarantee total annihilation, and small, determined forces can alter the course of campaigns. This lesson informed German planning, often leading to overconfidence in some areas and excessive caution in others, with consequences that reverberated throughout the war.
Dunkirk has been called a miracle, a heroic myth, and a strategic necessity. In truth, it was all three at once. It was a miracle of survival. The British Expeditionary Force faced annihilation, yet hundreds of thousands of soldiers escaped the beaches. The combination of bravery, coordination, and fortunate timing allowed an army to live when it seemed doomed. It became a myth because of the stories that grew around it. Civilians in little ships, the defiance of soldiers under fire, and Churchill's stirring words created a narrative larger than life. The myth emphasized courage, unity, and national identity, often glossing over the chaos, losses, and failures that were equally real. And it was a necessary defeat. Britain lost vast amounts of equipment, and France was left to collapse. Yet this defeat preserved the core of the army that would defend Britain, fight in North Africa, and return to liberate Europe. Without Dunkirk, the war in the West might have ended in 1940. The legacy of Dunkirk is complex. It reminds us that retreats can be strategic, losses can be lessons, and survival can become the seed of future victory. It shaped British identity, influenced German strategy, and became a moral symbol for a nation facing seemingly impossible odds. In the end, Dunkirk was neither a simple triumph nor a total disaster. It was a moment where courage, sacrifice, and chance converged, a reminder that even in defeat, hope and resolve can endure.